favorite quotes is that like well-behaved women rarely make history. Thank you, Eleanor Roosevelt. And as we know, girls with ADHD are not always the most well-behaved. Emotions, cognitions, and sensations are amplified for the girl with ADHD and boys. Unfortunately for us, puberty signals the escalation of mood symptoms like emotional reactivity, anxiety, and mood swings. Shifting premenstrual estrogen levels can cause roller coaster emotions. Girls with ADHD are typically diagnosed later than male peers at a mean age of 7. Girls with ADHD develop much more slowly than peers emotionally and socially. Girls tend to be hyper-talkative, hypersocial, and hyper-emotional, unlike boys who often present as hyperactive. Physical restlessness is like what we talked about earlier, is like the walking around, class helper, and it can just get missed. So the key areas that we're going to talk about today are masking, rejection sensitive dysphoria, and reward deficiency syndrome. And if anything comes up and you have a question, just write it into the box. So what is masking? Masking is any behavior that someone uses to make it appear to the external world like they are not living with a neurodivergence, like ADHD, OCD, autism. So anytime I refer to neurodivergence, that's what I'm talking about. Like other terms for masking are camouflaging, impression management. It's a process of hiding symptoms through learned behaviors. It's understudied and it leads to underdiagnosis, burnout, and extreme fatigue, anxiety, and loneliness. And it's also one of the things that leads to underdiagnosis. So it's something that we really want to be watching for and seeing. And girls happen to be especially good at masking because they're good at copying people and they're good at making friends and being social, and they're very relationally intelligent. So an example of masking is I appear very organized to the outside world, but only because I spend an immense amount of time and energy putting everything together or pulling everything together. So like your child gets to school and looks perfect, but the room is a mess. My house, this is more for an adult with ADHD, but like my house is an embarrassing cluttered mess. I don't let people come over. All of the pictures I take inside my home are carefully constructed or cropped to hide the clutter. And this is like teen girls I work with, I think often with Snapchat can get away with having a very messy room. I hate being late and I struggle mightily to get to events on time. If I see that I won't be on time, sometimes I cancel going to an event altogether to avoid hearing the comments about my tardiness. So, anything to avoid that external world learning about the chaos that's happening internally. So it's a big deal, and it takes a lot of energy to keep up the mask. Sometimes I work with kids and I ask them, like, what mask do you wear on the outside and what do you wear on the inside? And we actually do a project, creating a mask. What is rejection sensitive dysphoria? So I think you guys can guess what that is, but it's something that is actually also understudied. But when people read about it, most of them are like, I think I had that too. So it's something that all of us can kind of relate to, but for kids with ADHD, it's amplified. So it's not a formal diagnosis, but it's very common and it's a very disruptive emotional and it causes like severe emotional dysregulation. And it's like one of the most under-researched and misunderstood symptoms of ADHD. And it happens in adults too. So it occurs when an individual is hypersensitive to criticism or rejection. The way I explain it to kids really is that when they're looking out into a sea of people, they see frowning faces instead of smiling faces. And they've studied this in research with kids who have DMDD, which is a type of pediatric bipolar, but they are actually like using technology with emojis to help kids learn that faces are happy when they're looking out into them, and they're retraining the brain to learn that like the world is safe. And I find that very interesting. You guys can find that um, research if you just look on PubMed. Um, if you look up rejection sensitive dysphoria and how they're treating it. So again, just going back to slow it down a little bit, the person is looking out into a group of people, or let's just say an auditorium. We may all look out and see some happy faces, some neutral faces, some sad faces. Kids with RSD see people looking at them and judging them. And what that causes for them is a lot of emotional pain, basically. I mean, that's like the bottom line. So, withdrawal from social situations, sudden emotional outbursts, negative self talk, thoughts or self harm, avoidance of social settings in which they might fail or be criticized, low self esteem and poor self perception, constant harsh and negative self talk, rumination and perseveration, relationship problems, and the feeling of being constantly attacked. I feel like in my practice, the, the best thing that we can do is to educate kids and let them know what this is, so that when they feel it, it's not foreign. And they know that this is something that other people feel. So it's like the interconnectedness of common humanity, which is a part of self-compassion work. But then that begins the process of healing, right? It's like, oh, like I look out into this sea of people and I'm going to automatically see frowns. Like I have to actually cognitively make a choice to change that. And that gives someone power and autonomy over their experience. The next issue that I think is really important to discuss and consider is the brain of an individual with ADHD. So the dopamine pathways in ADHD brains are different. So key aspects of the reward systems are underactive in ADHD brains, making it difficult to derive reward from ordinary activities. So we call that reward deficiency syndrome. These dopamine deficient brains experience a surge of motivation after a high stimulation behavior triggers a release of dopamine. But in the aftermath of that surge of reward, they return to baseline levels with an immediate drop in motivation. One of the many consequences of reduced dopamine in the synapses is that the significance of a task is decreased. And that's why kids who have ADHD don't like doing mundane tasks, and they're not behaviorally reinforced. So parents ask me a lot, like, how am I going to get my kid to do chores? It's really hard. And it's really hard for them, right? Like, it's not just hard for you, parents. Like, it's actually hard for the individual with ADHD, because nothing is self-reinforcing. Like, I actually, I don't have a regular brain because I also have ADHD, but I don't know what it feels like to, brush your teeth and really feel good about that. But I make myself do it because it's a routine. And that's something that I'll talk about next, is like, how can we help? I think cultivate consistency and structure. The brain is very valuable. Our kids are young. The areas of the brain that are impacted by ADHD, also impact motivation and executive functioning and emotion regulation. And through consistency and structure, we can help our kids to create new neural pathways, better habits, and ways to live more effectively. So that's the good news. Our kids are going to be more likely to engage or want to engage in high risk or high dopamine activities, I'll say, like Instagram or TikTok, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but they don't have to. And if we identify and treat ADHD early and teach good habits and patterns, we can change the trajectory. So like one of the things that I really like to talk about a lot in my practice is communicating effectively and being really clear about what my expectations are with kids in the home. And I do that with families by discussing rewards and privileges with kids, right? Not rewards, responsibilities, responsibilities and privileges, right? So kids with ADHD work really well when there's some type of dopamine incentive. And so you're not going to ever get the high dopamine surge of like a winning the lottery, right? Or like scrolling on TikTok and getting just that constant. But when you know that you can't play video games unless you finish your homework, and that's the rule, and it's always been the rule, and you don't know anything different, then that just becomes like what you're used to, and that's safe and comfortable. And kids thrive when they have consistency and structure and know what to expect, especially when they're kids that have a lot of disorganization inside. Um, I always encourage parents to use like speech, visual, and tactile reminders at home, like use different ways to share information with your kids and remind them to take medication, to do chores, to go to appointments, and be very firm and direct. And if you have an expectation, make sure that they do it. Because if you waver, you lose momentum. And I think that can be really difficult. Plan ahead. Kids with ADHD need to know what to expect, have a daily routine. I think especially with girls in ADHD, there's an overlap with anxiety. And, that piece can make it very difficult because we don't have as many girls suffering with the hyperactivity and sort of like bouncing off the walls like the boys do, but it's like more of that social withdrawal and the fear and like not wanting to go out. And, that's, it's a totally different expression and something that we have to kind of push our girls to go out, to be more social, to help them through these friendships, to deal with the emotional roller coaster that I discussed earlier. And that's not something that we always think about when we think about ADHD, right? That our daughters are going to be really happy and then maybe really, really sad a minute later. And we don't know how to deal with the big, huge burst of emotions. So prioritizing rest is key. Food, water, helping your child to eat a healthy diet, but also to know like their hunger cues. A lot of kids who have ADHD, especially, I keep saying especially girls, but that's because we're talking about girls, but they don't eat because they don't notice that they're hungry and they get wrapped up in whatever they're doing, and they will come home from school and haven't eaten the whole day, and then they're grouchy. So, another thing I do in my practice is kind of slow down and track, like, what was the triggering event yesterday that caused the fight that you had with your mom? I didn't eat all day. I came home from school, we got into a fight because I didn't do this thing. I hadn't eaten. I was really tired, blah, 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 blah. Right? So there are things that we can do to prevent blowouts from happening and to teach healthy, consistent habits like drinking water, getting enough rest, eating, like packing protein bars or a yogurt for the kid, because these ADHD kiddos need a little bit more scaffolding. So again, like I'm going to just reiterate this because it may be boring for you guys, but identify expectations and privileges. Example, as soon as your homework is finished, you can talk to your friends on the phone. You can watch YouTube. You can, have time to do whatever you want to do. Making sure there's a balance between social media and outdoor time, I think, is really key for kids with ADHD just because social media is so seductive, and it does really, really hit like all of those dopamine receptors for kiddos with ADHD. So it's a really hard um, tool that, it's so useful. Oh, a question came in. I'm going to just read that really quickly. Yes. So thank you. Okay. I see a question that does the rejection sensitive dysphoria also include hypersensitivity to tone, voice, or is it just visual? And it totally does also include hypersensitivity to tone and voice. And thank you for that. That's a really good question. Please keep the questions coming, you guys. It will be so much more interesting. So yeah, it does. So kids will be like, I often hear that. They're like, my mom was yelling at me, and my kids say it to me. And I'm like, I wasn't yelling. I was just trying to get you to move out of the doorway so that we could get to the bus. Right. And so we have a different perspective about what happened. And then we have to come back and figure out where the disconnect was, right? Like, why did my child think I was yelling at them, but I wasn't? So I say this to a lot of people. Affect regulation occurs when during the repair. So when you have like a rupture with someone or a fight, it's not about what happened during the fight that causes damage or healing. It's what happens during the repair. So I hope that's helpful, right? So it's like, if the child is perceiving me in a negative way or saying I'm yelling, how do I attend to that after? So I just wanted to add that. So in terms of creating healthy habits, I'm going to go back to, emotion regulation and executive functioning are controlled by the same region of the brain. Routine and consistency helps to create and solidify the neural pathways that support motivation and success, which reduce feelings of inadequacy. We could be advocates for our children and ask questions. If you think your care provider is missing something or your teacher is missing something, I think, at home we see things before other people do, and we may notice something's off and not know what it is, and that's a good time to go and ask a provider. MedPsych does ADHD diagnostic testing, and it's a great asset because you don't have to do a whole neuropsych. You can do like a smaller subset of testing and get really good information. And ADHD can really be a superpower if the energy is channeled effectively. And that's like one of the really important aspects of I guess it's a disorder, right? But it's a neurodivergence too. And I think that's an important aspect to get across to parents, but also to the girls that I work with. You have a super powered brain, and if you can tap into it and utilize it, there are so many things that you can do. And at the same time, it can also feel like a handicap, which is really frustrating. As girls grow and their prefrontal cortex develops, they become much more able to organize and motivate and learn and manage their emotions. So that's the good news. It just happens later in life. I think that's like the gold at the end of the rainbow for parents with ADHD kids. So, that's just something to think about. I think early, like, key points that I really wanted to come back to, like when I'm thinking about like grit and self-confidence and like our educational system and like social media and like how like we failed our girls, is like we really need to work on early identification and treatment of ADHD in girls. Like, we need to get it right. We need to know what they look like. Yes, hi. I'm reading this question right now. Yeah, yeah, it's such an easy way to like, it's so interesting. It's so easy to use it as an excuse, right? Um, I think it really is a superpower because our brains like work so quickly and we can do so many things at once. If I think it has to do with medication probably and the tools that we've been taught, but it's we can multitask, like we can be engaged in like 25 different activities. We can be I guess you know what I'm wondering is actually like, what are, I didn't read your question. You asked me, can you talk more about what language to use with our daughters explaining how ADHD can be a superpower? So, and I've heard this before that a lot of kids are using ADHD as an excuse for behavior. And I think what I would actually start doing is saying that stop using that, allowing your child to use that as an excuse and saying I understand, like that's valid, okay, like ADHD makes things harder and you do have to work harder, but once you put in that work, your brain has the capacity to do more than anyone else's brain that's at this table. Does that feel fair? And then to keep reinforcing that, like you may have to do double the work to like put your shoes in the bin when you come into the house or to sit down and start the homework. But once you start, you're unstoppable. Okay, cool. Um, I love the questions, you guys. Really awesome. So again, going back to the like the grit and the self-confidence. So early identification and treatment, psychoeducation around the neurobiology of attention and motivation are so important to reinforce the need for skills and routines. I think really knowing that like this is something that's just different about your brain and that like you need different routines to live your life. Like I have a hook next to my back door and I put my keys on it so I don't lose them. And that's really, really helpful for me. I keep like my wallet and all of my stuff in a small purse and then I put that in my work bag. Like there's these little hacks that you learn over time that we can teach our girls when they're young that are going to make their lives easier. And executive functioning coaches can do that type of work with these kids now, and therapists like me. We have executive functioning coaches at MedPsych. We have lots of therapists who work with kids with ADHD, and we also have psychiatrists and PAs, which is great, and neuropsychologists who can do like a whole battery of testing. So, another, aside from my huge push to reinforce the need for skills and routines, consistent support and compassion, right? It's really hard. And I have a lot of compassion for you guys too, right? Like as parents, it's really hard. Um, it's really hard to be a kid with ADHD. It's really hard to be a parent of a kid with ADHD. And I think we can validate that for our kids and we can have a lot of compassion for them and still get frustrated, um, and acknowledge that certain tasks are harder for the dopamine deficient brain. The world can be invalidating, home doesn't have to be. That's a quote that I thought was important, and something just to remember. So, they may feel like they're trying twice as hard at school and never getting a reward. Um, at home, we can try to be a soft landing place. That doesn't mean that we have to tolerate intolerable behavior. We can radically accept somebody and not tolerate behavior that is inappropriate or unacceptable. I don't think ADHD is an excuse for behavior. And we can talk more about that if you guys have questions. Um, Co-regulation works especially well for highly social beings. So that's something to think about, also is you have somebody with ADHD who's like operating at a very high frequency and you want to connect with them and you want them to hear you. Sometimes you need to slow them down and get them to like co-regulate with you so that they can hear you. And ADHD folk are usually pretty open to the possibility of connecting with another person. It's harder for us to do it alone, but with someone, it works. So social media is a blessing and a curse, in my opinion. It's very difficult to monitor. It's a high dopamine activity. But again, like if you can channel it in a positive, I don't think we're going to be able to keep our kids totally away from it. And so in my last presentation, I was like, if you can't beat them, join them. So I always tell my clients, parents, you want to be friends with your kids on social media so you know what they're doing. I think you want to encourage like positive social media influences, right? Like, how can we get our kids to be seeing things that may be encouraging meditation? Like, I was trying to think about this last night, actually, before this presentation, because it really is hard when your kids are watching like TikTok videos of dances and I don't even know what else they watch, and skincare routines, and it becomes so obsessive. Like, how can we redirect that into something that is productive, that they're interested in, and engage with them in a meaningful way? And is that giving them a project to do of making their own TikTok video and then presenting that to you? I don't know, but I think that that's where we're at in, oh, good. Okay, so the next question is, how common is it for girls to not get diagnosed until high school? I think it's pretty common. There are like a lot of adult women who don't get diagnosed until they're in their 40s or 50s. And again, I think that speaks to the masking. Girls who are helpers, girls who show more anxiety symptoms than hyperactivity. We have much better diagnostic tools than we did in the past. And I do believe that therapy, I don't know that the therapy or approaches change if it's diagnosed late, but I think the impact on the individual is different, right? Because they've lived a longer life of masking, and like the stress that can have on um, the individual can be, it's more. But we would need to know more from her, what her experience has been, um, because everybody has a different threshold for stress. And I think usually when people like do get a diagnosis and start getting treatment for their ADHD and start learning about it, there's a lot of relief that can come. So I don't actually have any more slides, but I'd like to like kind of open it up now to questions. You guys have been really great about throwing them out. I also just want to speak, I guess I've woven into this presentation what we offer at MedPsych, but again, we offer neuropsychological testing. We offer a brief ADHD screening, which is not the full neuropsych. We have therapy, we have executive functioning coaching, and we can usually do a same day therapy appointment or consultation if that's something that you or your family might need. I am always open to any questions that you guys might have via email about ADHD or any other behavioral health question. It's really one of my passions, honestly. So I appreciate you guys all being here. And I'm looking to see if there's another question. So the webinar, somebody asked if the webinar can be shared, and it can. It's going to be on our YouTube page. I'm going to read another question, guys. It's about, I'm not going to read the whole question. I'm talking about kind of social. Yeah, so we have another participant who brought up like one of her kids has had struggles with social situations and noticed maybe some manipulation. Has anybody else noticed that with your kids? I think that's very common. You know, there are some kids with ADHD who struggle more socially, who can't relate, who are much more. Okay, I'm gonna wait. There's more question coming. But that definitely is something that social struggles are part of ADHD. And I think, you know, sometimes that just comes from a lack of awareness and, you know, the need for kids to learn how to slow down. So this, the question I see is like, any advice for using social media as a kid with ADHD for making friends or for social? I'm wondering if the question is about like, how could you use social media to learn social skills? Just using it appropriately. So I think that's a longer, like, I don't know that I have specific advice, but I do think I work with that a lot with my clients. And I think that's something I would want a therapist to be working with a child on, like for more time, because I would want to know like what they're seeing and how often they're looking at it and like what they get out of looking at this social media. And then identify, like I would identify like goals and values and kind of curate the experience with the child. That would be my goal as a therapist. And I guess as a mom, you could do that too. So from these resources, you know what? I I can send you guys my slides if we have your emails through the Eventbrite. Somebody asked if we have resources to share with the older girls, young adults that summarizes this information. I actually think this information is probably okay for most ages. I mean, they might not understand it, little ones. You can definitely have the slides, and in the slides are links to the articles that I use to write the presentation. So those are resources that I use often, and I think they can be really helpful, and you can go back to them and read the articles, you know, and then in those articles, there are links to other articles and resources that I think can be really helpful. Do you guys have any other questions?